Good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending our security roundtable. We're going to have an open discussion with some security questions. This is going to be a high-level discussion around people's approaches and plans, and certainly, hopefully, we cover quite a bit of good topics for everybody. So, next slide. Yep, and just to let you know who your panelists are, my name's John Berar. I'm a technology consultant with eGroup, and I have some experience with working in healthcare and financial services companies that are pretty sizable. I've been lucky enough to be part of 2 major breaches, so I can certainly draw some experience there. Brian, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, absolutely. I'm one of the co-IT directors over at Leader Dogs for the Blind in Rochester Hills, Michigan. I've been there for about 9 years with my partner. We divvy the responsibilities up for the management of data and security and infrastructure. Before that, I spent about 10 years as the IT director for the Charter Township of Clinton here in Michigan as well. So I'm knee deep in this stuff, so hopefully I have some kind of insights.
That's great, thank you. And Josh?
Yeah, my name is Joshua Morgan. I am the manager of IT infrastructure for ACD Operations. Previously, I've worked at an employment healthcare company that we had about 60 offices across the United States and in Europe. After that, about a 3,000 to 3,500 employee healthcare organization. And then I actually moved over to an actual healthcare organization that was a doctor's office. The 3,500 user one was more for insurance benefits management, and I was in charge of their internal IT infrastructure. So yes, migrated to Office 365, implemented MFA, gone through the security routes. Been fortunate to do that at the last 3 or 4 companies. And where I'm at now, we've been extremely lucky to build all this up from scratch, as we're a fairly new company. So I'm right in the thick of it as well.
Fantastic, and I appreciate you both for being our panelists today. And I think we're ready to start a discussion. So I wanted to start out just by showing a few graphics. And some of these come from NIST, some of them come from Microsoft, but just different thinking about security and how different components sort of play together and really what makes up a complete picture. And I want us to keep that a little bit in the back of our minds while we work through some of the questions that we're going to be tackling. So with that, we'll move to the first question for you guys, which is, what's your approach to keeping your organization secure? What's the high-level strategy of how you make sure that you've got systems that are secure, you're protected? What are your thoughts there? And I'll start with Josh.
All right. So I do take a single vendor approach for this environment. I've used a couple of different methods over the past few years, but the benefit right now, because as everyone knows, that it's not just about ease of use, right? It's also a lot of times about money, and it's when you take it to management and you say, hey, we have this option here. We have these users on E5s. Right, we're already licensed for X, Y, and Z. A lot of times that they come back to you and they say, well, can we leverage the products that we're already paying for? And fortunately for us, Microsoft has stepped it up in the last few years, right? It feels like it's a complete security package. Now, probably not taking a stab in the dark here. Everybody understands that you no longer can be that single person that manages the entire infrastructure across the board anymore with Microsoft, right? They have a lot of complex tools. They've been known to change things and not necessarily notify their customers. For example, I'm in Intune this morning, and they've changed some of the filtering features within Intune based off operating system, which is always a challenge. So yeah, you could say layered, but layered from the single vendor, right? I'm also a big proponent of the fact that, and I had I had a boss tell me this one time, a CIO, that we need to be secure, but we need to make sure that people can do their jobs. I worked at a place that security was so overwhelmingly frustrating that it literally added 30% to your time frame to do anything from an end user perspective, and then from an IT support perspective. So we kept it simple from that aspect, while layering in portions of security, and then had a monitoring team that would monitor that stuff. And that's the approach that we're taking here as well, right? Integrate the security so our end users don't realize that they're actually being secured. And then obviously, the training that goes along with it, sending out emails to say, hey, this is what phishing looks like. Here's how you alert for phishing. If you get a strange email from somebody that looks like our CEO, but it said it was sent from outside the company, don't reply to it. Immediately call Josh or call somebody else. So I think that's probably the start of how you approach it, or at least how I've approached it. But there's a million ways to slice that apple. So.
Sure, Brian, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, well, I'm going to find myself echoing Josh a little bit in this area. Of course, we're in a different sort of a situation where we're going into a transitional phase now, where we're kind of looking at the old gray mare way of doing things and seeing if that still applies. And in many cases, it doesn't in the new world. And we'll talk about that probably more as we go along. But when Josh mentions the layered approach, but from a single vendor, there's a tremendous benefit to that, right? Because the pieces work together naturally. Historically, it used to be a case where you could say, well, okay, I want to use this over here for this and this over there for that. So for instance, my MDM solution was over here, my AV malware, anti-malware solution was over here. And that had its benefits because the exposure of one didn't necessarily mean the exposure of the other. And that was the common logic. And in many ways, that's the way we've existed for some time here, where I am now and even where I was previously. But there is, especially now, and again, echoing Josh, Microsoft's solutions have become so much more comprehensive and legitimate when you think of the difference between Microsoft's Endpoint Defender product today versus just literally 5-6 years ago. Once time it was a joke. Now it's actually, a good solution. Suddenly that becomes more logistical. And then, of course, again, we're a nonprofit, so we're spending both sides of every nickel. So when you have, as you mentioned, E5 licenses or licensing that enables you to use things that are just sitting on the table, not being used, the CFO and the senior management team start saying, hey, is there a way we could shave a little over here and still meet the same level of security and usage? And again, you have to deal with that aspect of I'm being tugged over here for usability and you're being tugged this direction for security. When someone gets phished, suddenly security is the most important thing of the day. When someone can't get to a file because they lost their password or their MFA phone is, in their car and they didn't have it with them, now suddenly convenience is the pull. And that's going to go on forever. In this industry. So we just have to find that sweet spot in the middle where it's mostly ease of use and as much secure as we can get.
Yep. Are you both seeing too that maybe 10 years ago the single vendor solution wasn't as complete or there, and maybe as time's gone on and things have gone more into the cloud across all vendors, that's become more viable, and have you guys seen that as well?
I certainly have. Like I said, the recommendations that I used to make 10 years ago would have been, all right, let's find best of breed AV anti-malware, and let's find best of breed firewalling, and let's find best of breed VPN solutions. And it didn't matter if they were from the single vendor, and it didn't matter whether they even played nice together. We wanted the best possible thing because there wasn't a source where you could get all of that in a bucket that you could trust. And that has significantly changed. And it's not just Microsoft, although obviously, considering the audience, Microsoft is our focus. But I definitely feel like we've gotten to a place now where that's viable. Josh?
Yeah, I'll agree with that. A good example is when I started at Benefit Focus, we were very much a multi-layered shop. We had semantic antivirus. We had different tools that we rolled out. I think Carbon Black. We rolled that out to all the machines, right? And as we started digging in, Microsoft is coming in. We were an enterprise licensed partner or a customer of Microsoft, so they're coming in and presenting their spiel, and we were already buying this licensing. For whatever reason, we had to have some of the security pieces tacked on, either an E3 with an add-on, or we had executives and a certain level of people with E5s. And they started coming in, and my boss came to me and he says, look, we're spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on all these other tools. We need to see if we can leverage these. Well, at Benefit Focus, they were they had their own security department. So we worked hand in hand with the security department to basically do a bake-off. And at the end of the bake-off, right, about 6 months before I left over there, security was like, yeah, Defender does everything that we need these other products to do. So let's work on the process of phasing out the additional cost and those additional products and roll in the Microsoft products that we're already paying for. So yeah, I think I heard it was probably a Microsoft person that told me this, but at one point in time, I was told that Microsoft employs more cybersecurity people on their cybersecurity team than any company in the world, right? They've taken that type of approach. They realized where their gaps were, and they've worked hard over the last few years to really try to mitigate those gaps and become a true security provider.
Yeah, the single vendor approach seems to be more popular, and I also would add a little bit to this around the visibility on a platform like for example, Microsoft or Palo Alto or whatever, whoever the vendor, the visibility across workstations, servers, and network. I mean, you can really get at good forensics as well, and I think that that's been a big boost too. Part of this question was asking a little bit around monitoring too. So I think with good tools, some processes have to go in place as well. What are your thoughts? And I'll start with Brian on this in terms of what are your thoughts around how aggressive do you have to be with your monitoring, and what kind of process do you put around that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too, because historically the idea was the monitoring existed in a small department as more of a forensic tool. Something bad happened. Now let's go back to the logs and the monitoring and see when it happened and how to troubleshoot it. We've developed into now a world where that no longer works. If the proactive monitoring becomes fundamental. And beyond that, especially when you look at the tools that are available in Intune and endpoint management and such that Microsoft provides, the AI tools that and I hate using buzzwords like that, but really tools that say, hey, this looks suspicious based on patterns that we've seen before, that's wonderful. We exist in a world currently where we actually have a separate vendor. Speaking of a multi-pronged approach, we use a separate vendor's application that monitors our firewall and access logs, and basically does a kind of almost a Power BI style dashboard that we monitor on a regular basis. That's fine and has been fine, but as the world changes and becomes more dynamic, we absolutely see the benefit of increasing that visibility.
Yep, and just to add to that a little bit too, I think part of the challenge that I've seen with this is, there's thousands of events going on. How do you sort of sift out the things that matter from the things that don't? So I think that's got to be part of a monitoring plan as well. That's just my own experience, because literally thousands of events every day. Josh, what are your thoughts around the monitoring side of things?
Well, obviously it's important, right? You have to know when something happens. But I'll be honest with you, through my career, monitoring has been the largest challenge, right? It's easy to implement. I say it's easy. It's the challenge is not in implementing the security, right? Obviously, there's a level of security that takes some work. the key is to make sure that you get the right people, the right alerts when they need to see them. And we all talk about it. If you've been in IT for any amount of time, the noise that comes in and being able to filter out the noise. You know, I mean, I don't know about Brian, but I've worked at places where you almost, for a time, you have to dedicate a person that does nothing but sits there and looks at the things that are sending you the alerts to make sure that you're getting what you're supposed to, and then, that you're not seeing that ancillary noise through everything.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, that's always the challenge, right? I'll admit, right now, I have way more stuff in my inbox than probably what I should have, and the amount of and then you couple that with the amount of Microsoft announcements that you get, that come from Microsoft, but so does your your privileged access management notifications, right? That you get from Azure. So yeah, it's a big piece to it, and you have to be able to go in there and fine tune that.
Yep, and I'm just kind of calling out because I think you guys are both mentioned this too. Installing a product is, I'll say, relatively easy. It's operationalizing it and being able to manage it, monitor it, and know what to do with it, and have processes behind it. So I'd say to all of our folks that are listening in, along with the tools, you have to definitely think about the processes that go to support it, and what do you want to focus on, and what can you eliminate. And the last sort of thought I had on the single vendor thought was, and you guys have brought it up, I think the trick these days is to minimize the number of vendors. It's not the best of breed, but Microsoft has a certain niche that they play really well into, but they're not monitoring, for example, maybe firewalls in your infrastructure, VPN, some other things that they're not necessarily watching for. So you do need to complement that with other solutions, and certainly cover all of the layers of security across your organization. And I think with that, we could move to the next topic. So, and we've touched a little bit of it. What Microsoft solutions are you currently using or looking to adopt? Josh, do you want to start us off there?
Well, Microsoft security solutions. All of them, if I can.
Yep.
Right. So, like I said, we're a relatively new company. I started back in December of last year. So what's that? 10 months. Give me 1 second. As we're talking, I've gotten notice that I have to make a quick change to something regarding security.
Let me just switch over to, let me just switch over to Brian then, in terms of what solutions are you using and what are you looking to adopt?
Sure, absolutely. I think that's called a no-look pass, right? So we're, again, a little bit different. I mean, we've been effectively static in our infrastructure and the way we do things for about the last 5-6 years. We're kind of a hybrid shop. We use Office 365, but we also have the on-prem Active Directory and all of the classic, castle style moat around it infrastructure that you typically see in an IT solution. And now we're looking at, and this bleeds into our next topic, which we'll talk about ahead. We're looking at, okay, what does that look like going forward into the future? So even our PBX was on the chopping block, which is an opportunity for migrating to Microsoft's Teams PBX solution. And as far as the security model, though, the endpoint security is, as we've already been talking about, it's kind of getting to be best of breed now. So we can actually look at that as a replacement for our endpoint device management, which currently is one vendor, Sophos, and our MDM stuff for bring your own device control. We've been using another vendor for that, and even all the way on down to just asset management, right? Intune allows us to do a lot with what the devices are, maintaining, managing, and blessing and or cursing them, which is a transition, and that's the problem, right? Unlike someone who can start from scratch and just move forward with the new tools and the way it should be done, we have to find that transition point to move from what we currently are doing to what we want to be doing in the future.
Yep. Let me call off some of the solutions, and you guys pause where you'd like, but I would tell you, and I've come to learn more and more about what solutions are out there, like what pieces of the puzzle are there. So I'll name off a couple. Tell me what your thoughts are on this. And this is wrapped around the Microsoft side. And also, what have I missed? Because, for example, we've all talked about the endpoint protection, Defender for Endpoint. You guys are both using that, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Yep. Okay. The Defender for Office 365, where that does scanning for, SharePoint and OneDrive files. That's another component.
Mhm.
Email flow rules. That's another area, right?
Mhm.
MFA, multi-factor authentication, another area.
Yeah, can I make a comment on that?
Yeah, please do.
This is an interesting thing. Of course, obviously our Office 365 tenant is configured thus, so MFA is necessary for all users. But we found something interesting when we as an organization went to look into our cyber insurance policy. Cyber insurance companies are increasingly expecting MFA to be in place for all valuable assets in the information infrastructure. So what we found was that they dinged us a little bit because we still had an on-site Active Directory that did not require MFA for access, although we had the hybrid solution. So that's been part of our motivation to move everything to the AAD-focused infrastructure, where that's the source of authentication and such, so that MFA protects all of the things. And that's an interesting motivation that wasn't there even just 6 to 8 months ago.
Yep, I think that's a great point. It's an ever-evolving world. It looks like, Josh, you had a comment as well?
Yeah, so I will add to that, right? So we obviously it is easier to start from scratch, and I've done both, right? I might, Benefit Focus. We migrated their environment from on-premise to Office 365, and ventured into Azure for various different pieces. I will say this, right? I know that we're focusing on how great Microsoft is. There are some frustrations, right? As I have built out this environment, or begun to build out this environment, Microsoft pushes MFA. They push Windows Hello for Business, which is something that we leverage. And at a previous company where I helped consult a little bit, we couldn't go down that road because we had multiple users on one machine, right? So Hello for Business was a challenge because they would have a different PIN at every single machine they would go to, and then it was obviously challenging from a support standpoint. But Microsoft goes through all that. But as you build machines in the cloud, depending upon how you access those machines, and Microsoft pushes RDP at some level. They also push Azure Bastion, which is a more secure component, which I get there is a RDP layer above that. But to get interactive login with an Azure AD only environment is probably the worst implemented thing across the board that Microsoft does. I have to set up a conditional access rule for people accessing those boxes to turn off MFA because they don't follow their own mindset, right? So know that if anyone on the call is going to that level, right, then you have to take those things into account. So one of the things that we're doing, right, is I'm actively trying to convince my boss to sign off on a PSA with eGroup, but to roll out a small version of Azure Virtual Desktop, because I can still control access to my backend. Think of it like a jump server mentality. I can control access to the back end, but then I can enforce a level of MFA, especially if I have to integrate consultants and things like that I don't want to provide blanket VPN access to, because Microsoft still has a shortcoming, right? They don't do a lot of HIP checks and a lot of rules for Azure VPN, right? It's literally, you can enforce MFA, but that's really all you can enforce. If someone's machine that you're allowing is infected, there's still a challenge there. So as Microsoft grows, we grow, right? But yeah, I think all of it is across the board. So you mentioned MFA. I'm not sure what other security solutions we want to nod our head about or shake our head about.
Yeah. Well, I think each of the ones that I'm kind of calling off, one of the reasons I'm calling them off is, I wasn't aware of some of them until recently, because it does ever expand. And Josh, I think you're bringing up a really good point that, it's not all rainbows and unicorns. There's nuances for each of these capabilities. And some of the trick is getting to know the nuances and how to work around something like, I've got multiple people signing into a PC, but I want to use Windows Hello. So I definitely think that there are some challenges. I'm curious to, somewhat related on this is, Microsoft as a whole data loss protection capability. What are your thoughts on that? And maybe I'll switch over to Brian to kick us off, and if you've experienced it or looking to adopt it, or other thoughts around DLP.
Yeah, well, that's probably one further step down the road than we're at this moment. Basically, as I mentioned, we're still in that transitional stage. We're getting data that lived locally and was accessed locally, and we have, like any organization does, the whole spectrum of users, from the very high awareness, very technically savvy, all the way on down to the why are there so many buttons on this typewriter style user. So we have to tread very carefully as we move the cheese, so to speak. So that's, as we're moving that's under consideration. We actually have a little subcommittee of our technology group that's looking at implementing all of those things. So it's hard to speak to that yet.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something that we're looking at, because obviously maintenance of that data that used to be so easy because it was right in the server down the hallway, right?
Right. And extra points if by moving the cheese, you're referencing Who Moved My Cheese.
Totally.
Good bonus points there. Josh, what are your thoughts on DLP and whether companies should adopt it?
Yeah. So I've implemented it the last 3 companies over the last 4 or 5 years. Office 365 had the DLP components built into it before it really became M365. Benefit focused on everything: PCI, HIPAA, any level of privacy that you could imagine. The company that I was with after Benefit Focus, the same thing, right? They were actually a series of doctors' offices. Here, it's a little less, right? What you have to focus on, obviously, there's PCI. If you deal with any type of customer interaction, I think you have to turn on a control of PCI. You don't want someone inadvertently sending a credit card number. You don't want someone inadvertently doing something wrong. But what's been fascinating here is it's been more focused on the corporate management, right? We don't want someone accidentally sending anything out about our product that we're not ready to send out yet, right? There's corporate controls that we have to put in place. So again, it's been nice being able to not put people in my environment till I had some of these controls in place. But yeah, I've used them in both places, and I think Microsoft does a pretty good job. Now we go back to benefit focus and security challenges, right? Security departments, those guys actually tested and hammered the DLP environment pretty heavily because they had to check some boxes for sign off on certain things like PCI compliance and things like that. And Microsoft admittedly has gotten better, right? We found an issue early on, probably I want to say 4 to 5 years ago, that if you had more cells in you could fill out an Excel spreadsheet with credit card numbers, and Microsoft would actually at that point in time quit scanning after like the 5,000th cell in the Excel spreadsheet. And those guys found it quick. So we took it to Microsoft. We made some adjustments, and they were really good about getting it fixed. So yeah, I think it's a top tier product, and it's something that I'd use everywhere I can. But you do have to be careful rolling it in, because you can affect a lot of stuff, especially if you have legacy data within your environment.
Yep. And I'm just going to take us back to MFA a bit, because I think, again, speaking to some of the nuances and more broadly, if you have a lot of exceptions to your security rules, it starts to get very complicated. And at some point, it's almost difficult to figure out why things are happening. So I am a big fan of no exceptions. And so I'm curious if you guys have come across this. A colleague of mine a while ago came up with a great idea, which was all accounts have MFA literally all of them, including admin accounts, service accounts, and user accounts. And there are ways to make that happen, where the method that we used was, so if you're on the networks that our data centers using for service accounts, you didn't need to provide MFA. But if you were off those networks trying to get at things with the service account, you were prompted with MFA and you couldn't use it. So I'm just a little bit curious if you guys have adopted that sort of all or nothing strategy, and comments around the approach that I took.
Yes, so I can answer that. I have. I've done it here. We also had it at Benefit Focus, rolling the last company, which was Crossroads Treatment Centers, rolling them into MFA across the board because of the user community, right, was a challenge. It's easy to say when you have either a small subset of users or people who are more technically adept, that this is the process that you need to go through. You have to look at your user community when you roll that stuff in, because you're gonna wreak havoc on yourself. But let's also talk about what MFA is, right? I'm going to say I'm very fortunate to be able to leverage Intune and Autopilot. So the registration of those machines is one factor, right? So I say that the machine is a trusted machine, and your request is coming from a trusted machine. So that's one. So the second factor is, do these people have a password to log in with, right? So we know that it's a trusted machine and it's a trusted user. Now, once they venture out from that, here I'm a little bit more lenient. I have people who can access potentially their email and stuff like that off of non-company machines, but they're popped from an MFA when they do that, right? That's where the MFA component comes in. And then I get more control depending upon what the item is. If they're going to go access a server from even their corporate machine, they'll get popped from it for an MFA. At Benefit Focus, you could not access any company information unless you were coming from a company approved machine. And then we layered in additional components of MFA on top of that, right? So depending upon what you were doing, you had to enter your credentials or approve the process.
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
That's a great approach. Brian, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's funny how you were talking there about exceptions, and the reality of it is, and I think everybody knows that exceptions are the devil of security, right? Because it's that one account that you had to do the thing with that then doesn't get documented. If there's anything we in IT generally tend to do worse than study our logs, it's document things, right? So if we forget that one account, that exception to the rule, then of course that's the thing that comes back and bites us. As it stands right now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, all of our real, live, honest, wetware human beings have multi-factor required just to access our Office 365 at all, whether it's their email or their OneDrive files or anything like that. As far as service accounts, that's an interesting thing, right? Because even up until recently, there were certain things you had to step around MFA for, even to do administrative tasks inside the tenant. That seems to have been handled, and I think everyone recognizes that was kind of an awkward situation. As of right now, we're looking at we have a couple of external applications that require integration with our logins locally that don't understand MFA if we were to try to move them out. So that's a challenge. And the other thing is, and of course, it's right there in the title of our organization, we have an accessibility thing. We have multiple users, both volunteers as well as team members that are visually impaired. And that complicates MFA in multiple ways, whether it's the inability or reluctance to use the Authenticator app, whether it's the complexity of using SMS, which unfortunately, it's sometimes the only default thing you can use, but it becomes difficult for using that for our differently abled team members. So we're as of the moment, like I said, everybody has to do it to get to that. But as we're moving things out, it has to be in place, right? That's the ultimate goal. And we're looking for one of the nice things, though, and I should distract myself from rambling here, is that many of the, or at least the majority of the things that we're looking at do enable a OAuth arrangement. So for single sign-on through Azure or and Office Microsoft 365. So that kind of sidesteps the whole issue, right? They just go there, they get the authentication token, they get authenticated through the MFA over there, and it doesn't have any issue with it over on the other side. But it's a transitional thing, and we're still stepping through that minefield.
Yep, and I'll just kind of wrap up this slide with one other thought on MFA, that some companies don't have to worry about an international footprint. So things like SMS messages to phones mostly works. But when you start talking about international travel and people traveling with their phones, you really do need to think through what's the best methods on that. And I think I'll take us to the next slide, which, given the times and my favorite word these days, unprecedented times with COVID and people working remotely, we certainly have to talk a little bit about that, because I would tell you that I had very good security wrapped around my organization, and then we all went remote. And some of the things that I had in offices, all of a sudden I didn't have anymore. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to put this question to you two, in terms of, so having a workforce that all of a sudden isn't in my controlled network facilities anymore, what has that done to changing the mindset or approach to security? And Josh, if you're able to, maybe I'll start with you on that question.
Yeah. So I'll go back to Crossroads, right? So we're running along and COVID hits, and because we were medical facilities, we didn't shut down. And at that point, we didn't even send people home, even from the administrative side. And then we had COVID run through the office, and it was immediate. It was quite literally come in on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, everyone in that office had to have the ability to work from home. Well, we were in the process of refreshing the laptop fleet, so I had guys in the office working 15-hour days for the next 2 days, building laptops, sitting there handing them out, showing people how to connect a VPN to do X, Y, and Z. Fortunately, we had some things in place, as such as Intune and Autopilot and Defender and things like that were already there. Here, we are a 100% remote workforce, right? So when you take that into account, right, we don't do, I understand eGroup is a BYOD shop, right? We don't do that. Everybody gets their own corporate control machine. So, there's the challenge of Autopilot, right? Because for me, from a logistical standpoint, I have to be able to drop ship machines directly from Dell to somebody's house. So those machines already come provisioned and ready to go. And then once they're enrolled in Intune, it takes approximately, I think, 15 minutes to go through the process, the login process, the provisioning process to then get the stuff to the machine. But during that process, there's encryption that we require. There's the Windows Hello for Business, which we require, and then there's the ancillary things to get the applications and stuff rolled out to the machines. So, Microsoft does a good job with their tool set about getting updates and patches and monitoring and things like that. But you just have to be sure that you've got all that base set up, kind of like building a house, right? You got to have that base in place.
Yeah, very much so.
And I was fortunate to already have that in place in both situations.
That's great. Brian, what are your thoughts in terms of when folks went remote? Did your folks go remote, and did that change anything in terms of your approach to security?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I thought about this a lot, and I settled on a phrase: change no, reinforce yes. So we've always had some remote workers. We have field representatives that travel the country and follow up with clients. So we've always had a relatively robust old school style remote workforce, tied into a VPN, certificates checked, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the vast majority of the team worked on site. Then, as Josh said, COVID hit and everything kind of went sideways. Like he described, we didn't close. One thing about having 200 dogs on site is they do need to be cared for. So people still had to physically attend work, but the administrative staff all went remote, many of whom had never done it before. And our existing remote infrastructure worked. It strained a little bit, required a little bit of tuning and knob turning, but it functioned. But what it did is it brought to top of mind for the administrative strategic planning that this wasn't going to go away, even if the pandemic did. The realization that work could be done, and in some cases more efficiently, particularly in the case for our philanthropic folks who are always on the move without physically attending, has opened them up to the idea that, hey, we need to keep doing this, and how can we do it better? The scary thing that I found was that because it worked okay old school, the recognition of the dangers and the potential pitfalls of the future didn't always surface. You only saw the good parts, right? So it's been kind of incumbent on us to say, okay, very exciting. Yes, we absolutely want to support remote work. We do need to think about things, and a lot of the things that Josh just talked about, things like, autopilot, things like, endpoint management through Intune, those kinds of things that we weren't bothering with before because everything was so centrally located, now have to be addressed and implemented, because this is now something that by mandate we're going to continue to do.
Yeah, this is, I think, an interesting topic for me too, because things did change, and even my approach changed a little bit. So I was fortunate in one way that I had gone down a cloud migration path 3 years prior to COVID hitting, and about the time that it hit, most everything was cloud-based. And we had a very high traveling population anyway, so things had to work on the road in low bandwidth environments with bad connectivity, right? That was the mark that we shot for. And when COVID hit, 1,000 people went remote in a weekend across the globe. And I think we had an issue with one application that wasn't accessible, so we worked through that. But my point in bringing that up is, I think as you're trying to pace yourself with technology, if you are an early adopter, you probably had an easier time going remote if you're an early cloud adopter. If you're chasing that a bit, you're working on VPNs and network bandwidth and data center infrastructure and a lot of other things. So to me, I think it reinforced my thinking around trying to ride the wave of good technology versus trying to, chase or swim up the back of it, because it's a lot harder. But I will reinforce the point of, I had capability inside my network in terms of intrusion detection system, scanning that was going on that I lost when people went remote. But that did get offset a little bit about, better integrated security on the workstation, conditional access around the workstation. But I do think there are important things that should be in place. And I'm going to take us to the next slide, and I'm just watching the time here. I think the next slide might be our last. We had a few more questions planned, but I think we'll see where this slide goes. But for folks that are listening, and your opinions, Josh and Brian, what do you think the top couple, 3 things everybody should have in place and do? And who wants to tackle that one first?
I'll take a shot. I have 3 things that mostly because they're top of my mind.
Yeah.
So you get what you pay for. So first of all, and again, we're talking specifically about security here, and we can't walk away from this conversation without discussing the uptick of ransomware worldwide. So having a ransomware strategy, and as we mentioned, there are a lot of pieces to the Microsoft toolkit that can assist in that, but having a strategy, thinking not if, but when we are confronted with something like that is a fundamental thing to at least have in place. Have a playbook. The second thing I thought of is, again, top of my mind, because it was not that long ago that we had an incident, and that is an exploit training and phishing training for the end users. these are certain things you can't patch, right? As a friend of mine says, you can give new firmware to the hardware, you can patch the software, but you can't do anything about the wetware. Humans are humans, and so keeping that in the minds of all of your end users will go a long way toward making the technical solutions you put in place actually protect you. And then finally, this concept that we're going through right now, the idea of remodeling the network structure to one that is more in the quote unquote zero trust model that is top of everyone's mind. The new way of working has broken the old model. The as I mentioned, the castle with the moat of your network behind its firewall. So now we all have to look at conditional access. We all have to look at multi-factor authentication through cloud services. All of these things, because that old model, it just doesn't hold up. So those are my three things.
Yeah, I think you've got really good, and there's 50 things we should do, but those three things seem to jump out. And having a ransomware strategy got to be number one. Conditional access in terms of multi-factor authentication and qualifications of a PC and credentials to get you into the systems. Again, I think very solid. What was your third one too?
Training your users for phishing and exploits.
Yep. Training. I'll add a little bit to that because I had worked quite a bit, about a year doing the training sessions. And I found where I got to was about 95% of the people got there, and 5% I just couldn't get them over the hurdle for whatever reason. And I think multi-factor to me gave me some level of assurance of, well, even if they click on something and do their credentials, they still have some level of protection, kind of. Josh, what are your top three?
Yeah, I think those are pretty close, right? I think you have to look at the low-hanging fruit and what's easy for your users. I mean, if we're talking strictly Microsoft Stack and Office 365, the link and attachment scanning is probably the easiest thing to implement. It's literally like 3 clicks and it's on and you're done. End user training. I cannot champion that enough, right? From someone who came from an organization with over 3,000 employees, and I think the key to that, right? I'm the IT guy, right? I can send out emails saying, "Hey, everybody, you need to pay attention that if this email comes in from the CEO, that it has this yellow bar across the top that says from outside the organization. Don't go buy a gift card and send it to him to a mailing address that you don't know," right? What needs to happen, right, is management and executives need to take some ownership into that as well, because it hits home a lot of times where, someone down the hallway is like, well, it's just the IT guy being the IT guy, right? I think when it comes from upper management, even though you've given them what to say, if it comes from someone like that, look, I'm never going to send you an email asking you for X, Y, and Z, and I'm always going to send you an email from a company account. Right.
Yeah.
Please pay attention to that long term. Education, end user education, and constant end user education. And I'll even go so far as to say Microsoft does a really good job of providing you tools to help educate your users, right? There's some things that you can do from within the security center where you can send fake phishing attempts and see the results. And then you can focus in on who those end users are and help them understand better about what they need to do.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good way to look at it. And then you also on your slide here, you have MFA and conditional access. I consider those the same thing, right? I rolled out conditional access, and MFA is just a component of that. So some of those are a little easier to do than others, but I think user education, the low-hanging fruit like link attachment and scanning, and then obviously things that you can do to control access within the environment is good as well.
Yeah, I think all those are really good. The other one I didn't put on here just to spark it a bit is really good patch management on both end user computers and servers and any other infrastructure that you have. I think that's probably one I would add to that list. But I think we're all talking about conditional access. We're all talking about ransomware, the attachment scanning, Josh, to your point, end user training and patch management. Those are some of the real big, I think, big necessary ones. So I think, we've got several more questions. We've got about 8 minutes or so. I don't know if folks want to pose any questions or want to take any questions. And then I think we could wrap up our call here shortly.
Well, I will add one thing, John, to
Yep.
because the list of questions, one of the last ones is where do people start? And I couldn't help but think that it's an incredibly valuable thing, and it's really how we got to know about you, eGroup, and that is this idea of getting another set of eyes to help you look at what your challenges are, what you're planning to do, what you like to do, and having that expertise just kind of look over your shoulder and say, don't miss this little spot, right? We talk all the time, or we've talked over the last few years about something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you know just enough to think you're an expert, where if you knew a little bit more, you'd realize how little you knew. And that is unfortunately the case with IT. A lot of times, because we are experts in a certain box, we sometimes lose that second set of eyes that says, oh, here's a gap in our knowledge. So getting assistance from even just discussions like this roundtable can often be very helpful to start the process of thinking about what do I do next.
Brian, you just got your second kudo around the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's an awesome reference. That's where 90% of drivers think they're better than average, right? So that was a great reference too. So good, great. All right, I think with that, Carly, can you take us past the question slide? I just want to show one more thing. Yep, that was the one. One more slide up. That's the one. So this is an amazing slide to me. This is Microsoft Security Reference Architecture, and I think this speaks to the point of really having another set of eyes on here, and maybe a couple different set of eyes, because this is a complicated diagram. This is a lot of the capability that's there and what tools and capability is there. And I do think having those discussions with a trusted partner, maybe one or more, would certainly help, which takes me to the next slide, which is what can folks do next? They can certainly take the journey themselves. eGroup has a tremendous amount of experience helping organizations, my old organizations, both of yours, but certainly can contact us or sign up for security assessments. And for our last slide, I think there's some contact information. Here's how you can get a hold of us. So I really appreciate Brian and Josh, you taking some time out to spend with us today and answer some questions. I really do appreciate your participation. And for other folks on the call, thank you as well. And with that, we'll wrap it up, and I hope everybody has a great day. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Take care.